was in Hebrew, but I don't know Hebrew well enough to bring that here and show you in front of you like this and try to pronounce it. I took Hebrew in seminary. I had a whole year of it, and I got an A, and then I just forgot it because I happen to trust the translations. But anyway, I have other reasons as well. I have a tool that I look on my computer, and it tells me everything that I used to know, and it just reminds me. Anyway, it's a long story. I do know some Greek, though, and so I can read this to you somewhat. I can pronounce it at least. This is from Romans 10:17 in the authoritative Greek New Testament. It's called the Westcott Hort New Testament, or the Nestle Allen number 27, in case you wondered. And so we're reading Romans 10:17, and in the Greek it says, Ara he pistis ex akoes he de akoe diachrematas Christou. Okay? Now that means, if we were to translate those words bit by bit, it means therefore-ish. Ara doesn't totally mean therefore, but it mostly means therefore. It could mean consequently or something along those lines. Hey pistis. Pistis is the word for faith. And hey is the definite article, the word the, so technically it means the faith. But in Greek, whenever you have an abstract noun, you put a the in front of it, and so it's just faith. In English, we have abstract, definite, and indefinite nouns, and Greek only had two kinds, so they would put in hey in front of it. And by the way, it just makes it sound cool. Hey pistis. So then Greek doesn't need an is in a sentence. They can just throw a bunch of words down there, and you know that there's supposed to be an is in there, and you know where the is supposed to go. In English, we have to throw it down. So there it is. It's hiding right there. Then ex means from. Akoes is the word that means hearing when it's with from hearing. And then the second line, hey, de, together means and or but. It's a really great language that you can have both and but be the same word. But it's kind of cool. You know, it just means the two things are connected very strongly. And hearing, akoe, the same word as hearing, is through word of Christ. Okay, there you go. So therefore, faith from hearing and hearing through word of Christ. If I were to say that to you, you would say, oh, that's awesome. That makes all the sense in the world. No, we kind of need it to be English. You can translate all the words, but the words don't necessarily translate into English. We have to make it into a sentence. And this is where our problem comes when it comes to translating. Before I illustrate the problem of translating and how we try to solve it, what I'm going to do is just show you how different translations deal with this one. So here we go. Here is the ASV, called the Authoritative Standard Version, or the American Standard Version. I believe this one is the Authorized Standard Version, the ASV usually. So belief cometh of hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. King James Version. So then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Pay attention. King James has the word God instead of Christ at the end of that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The New King James, so then faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. The New American Standard Updated, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. The New Revised Standard, so faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the word of Christ. The ESV, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. The NIV, consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word of Christ. The New Jerusalem Bible, but it is in that way faith comes, from hearing, and that means hearing the word of Christ. So, let's go on. The New Living Translation, yet faith comes from listening to this message of good news, the good news about Christ. And finally, the message, the point is, before you trust, you have to listen. But unless Christ's word is preached, there's nothing to listen to. Okay, now, do they all say roughly the same thing? Yeah, they do. They all say roughly the same thing, although some of them have embellished it a little bit more. The message I'm throwing up here because many people consider it a translation, but it was really done by one man, and so it's part-way translation, part-way paraphrase. We're going to talk about it in just a little bit, but you could see that almost every one of them said exactly the same thing, except the NIV, the one that we use, threw in a couple extra words to make the sentence a little more readable, and the King James Version just simply got the word Christ wrong. They turned it to the word God. And there's some reasons for that that we can get to later. But so there's the translation thing. And if anyone comes up to you and says, well, there are so many different translations, how do I know I can trust them? You can just say, okay, well, let's look at 10 of them and see if they're really different. See if they're really all the same. Because quite frankly, I got to be honest with you, almost every single modern translation is roughly the same in almost every verse. There are a few verses where they change it a little bit because Paul's writings are difficult and some people distort them. And so to prevent distortion, different translators have to translate things in the way they feel is the most clear. So here are the different kinds of translations. You might want to write this down. 4 types of translations. Translation type number 1 is what we would call the word-for-word translation, or some people call it the literal translation. Word-for-word translation basically means every Greek word has one English word, and we're going to try to make sure that there's a one-to-one correspondence all the time. So if the Greek word is akoe, we're always going to use the word hearing. And if the Greek word is hey, de, we're always going to use the word but, because that's the most likely translation, even though we just saw how all these other translations used hey, de, and translated it to mean and. So anyway, you have to make a one-to-one correspondence between the word in the text and the word in English. That's very difficult to do. Because see, some words have multiple meanings. I'll just give you an example. Let's take English. The word head has a lot of different meanings. It means the thing sitting on top of an animal's shoulders or a human's shoulders. It means the front edge of a line. It means the front of a classroom. It means the source of a stream. It also means the boss in the company. The head of the corporation is always the boss. And so head means a lot of different things. Luckily for us, the Greek word kephale means most of the same things. And so there's a one-to-one correspondence there. But there are a lot of words where that doesn't happen. Like, for example, the word pistis means faith, but really it also means faithfulness. And in English, those are 2 different words. They sound the same, but they mean different things. Faith is what you believe. Faithfulness is how you live. The Greek word pistis means both of them. The Greek word anthropos means man or person. And in English, we have now divided those 2 to say man or person. And so some Greek words can't be directly associated with one English word. So there you go. Word for word has its benefits. It lets you know what the Greek says, but it has its detriments too. The next kind of translation is what we would call the thought for thought translation. The thought for thought translation is equivalence, or sometimes it's called dynamic, depending on how the different translators work it. If you were to open up the Bibles that we pass out here and read the preface, it would say that we try to balance word for word and thought for thought in a dynamic equivalence, which means when there is word for word, we'll do it. When there's not word for word, we have to go thought for thought. I'll give you an example. Thought for thought. When I was in seminary, there was a guy in my classroom from the Ukraine. And my professor was an older man standing up front. He must have been in his late 60s. And he was talking about something, and he said, he was trying to illustrate a moment in his life when he was very embarrassed. And he said, and so I had to eat crow, because he felt very shameful. And this guy from Russia raised his hand. And he was like, I don't understand. Why?